Hello and welcome. Take a slow, deep breath, in and out. Feel the stillness of this moment wrap around you, like a warm blanket on a chilly evening. Outside your window, perhaps you can imagine the faint rustle of leaves whispering secrets to the night air. A candle flickers softly nearby, its golden glow casting gentle shadows across the room. And in the quiet, there is peace. Allow yourself to sink into that peace now, loosening the tension in your shoulders, letting your breath flow like a calm river. You are safe here, and your mind is free to wander. Now, as you rest, let me tell you a story of beauty, mystery, and a strange obsession from long ago. Transition to storytelling. Our story today begins in the heart of the Victorian era, a time of elegance, of rigid manners and dazzling gowns, of flickering lamplight and endless fascination with appearances. Yet beneath the lace gloves and polished etiquette, there existed a strange and haunting practice, a beauty ritual that turned living women into ghostly visions. It was fueled by a peculiar drug, one that promised allure but carried with it shadows darker than the night. So, let us drift gently back in time, to gaslit streets, horse-drawn carriages, and velvet-curtained parlors, where whispers of this drug spread quietly among women who longed to appear delicate, fragile, and ethereal. Victorian beauty standards. In the 19th century, beauty was not merely a matter of appearance, it was an unspoken language. Pale, translucent skin was considered the height of refinement. A complexion untouched by the sun suggested wealth and purity, for it implied that a woman need not labor outdoors. To look fragile, almost spectral, was to embody an ideal of feminine delicacy. Women powdered their faces with rice flour, dabbed on lead-based cosmetics, and shielded themselves from the sun with lace parasols. But for some, even these rituals were not enough. They sought a beauty so pale, so unearthly, that it made them resemble creatures of mist and moonlight. It was here, in this yearning for the ghostly ideal, that the strange drug entered the scene. The allure of atropine, the substance was known as belladonna, derived from the deadly nightshade plant. Its name in Italian means beautiful woman, and beautiful, at least to Victorian eyes, it seemed to make them. Belladonna was already infamous in history. For centuries it had been used as a poison. Legends whispered of assassins slipping its extract into cups of wine, of rivals silenced by its deadly touch. Yet in the Victorian age it was reborn not as a weapon of death but as a cosmetic. Women discovered that by applying drops of belladonna extract to their eyes, their pupils would dilate. The result was a wide, dark gaze, dreamy, soft, and almost otherworldly. It gave the impression of innocence, of vulnerability, a look that stirred fascination in those who beheld it. But belladonna did more than widen the eyes. It also blanched the skin, slowed the pulse, and gave women a frail, ethereal appearance, as though life itself were draining from them. They became living ghosts, admired for their delicate beauty, even as the drug quietly gnawed at their health. A dangerous seduction. Imagine a young woman in her boudoir. The curtains drawn, the soft lamplight casting golden halos on the wallpaper. She lifts a tiny glass vial, no bigger than her thumb. Inside, the liquid glimmers, a tincture of nightshade, deadly and alluring. She tips her head back, lets a single drop fall into each eye. Moments later, the mirror reflects a transformed vision. Her pupils, dark and vast, give her face a doe-like expression. Her cheeks appear even paler against the hollow of shadow. She looks almost like a spirit caught between worlds. To those around her, this appearance is captivating. They do not see the dizziness that follows, the dry throat, the racing heart. They do not see the headaches or the blurred vision that soon set in. They see only beauty. the kind of beauty that society rewarded, even at great cost. Society's silent approval. The Victorian world was filled with contradictions. On the one hand, morality and restraint were praised. On the other, an undercurrent of obsession with appearance drove women to risk their health for fleeting admiration. Magazines of the time whispered of belladonna as a fashionable secret. Cosmetic sellers marketed it subtly, offering eye drops that promised to enhance loveliness. No warnings were given of its dangers, for to admit the risks would tarnish its allure. And so, parlors and drawing rooms filled with women whose stares were widened by poison, whose beauty was haunted by a quiet suffering. The ghostly ideal, what is haunting, is that this pursuit of beauty mirrored the era's fascination with fragility itself. To be pale, to faint easily, to seem delicate, to the point of vanishing, these were qualities admired in women. Sickness was romanticized. Tuberculosis, for instance, was called the romantic disease, for its sufferers grew thin, pale, and flushed with fever, appearances mistaken for tragic beauty. Belladonna only amplified this ideal. Women became pale phantoms at the ballroom, their eyes dark pools under candlelight, their bodies weakened by the very drug that made them so admired. They were praised as visions. Even as the cost of such visions chipped away at their health, their clarity, their very lives. Early warnings. Of course, not everyone was blind to the dangers. Doctors began to notice troubling patterns among women who used the drops regularly. They reported cases of hallucinations, memory loss, even blindness. The heart, strained by the drug, sometimes gave out entirely. But in a world where women had so few avenues to gain admiration or influence, the temptation remained. For many, beauty was not a luxury. It was a form of power, however fragile. And so they continued, risking everything for a glance in the mirror that reflected back society's ghostly ideal. Closing this first chapter. And so, dear listener, we pause here. In the candlelit parlors of the Victorian age, where beauty was sought with whispers of poison, and where women willingly became ghostly apparitions for fleeting approval. As you breathe slowly, let your mind linger on this image, the soft rustle of silk gowns, the glow of gaslight, and the haunting presence of women turned spectral by a dangerous secret. This is only the beginning of our journey into the strange world of the Victorian drug that turned women into living ghosts. The shadowed origins of belladonna. To truly understand this ghostly fashion, we must drift even further back. Long before the gaslit streets of London, long before the corseted figures of the Victorian ballroom. Belladonna's story begins in the tangled woodlands of Europe. There, hidden among ferns and moss, the deadly nightshade plant grew wild, its purple flowers nodding gently, its berries gleaming like drops of ink. For centuries, the plant was both feared and revered. Folk healers and wise women of the Middle Ages knew of its dual nature. A carefully measured tincture could soothe muscle spasms or dull pain, but just a little too much. And the line between medicine and poison vanished instantly. Legends even claimed that witches used belladonna in their so-called flying ointments, concoctions said to bring visions, dreams, and journeys beyond the veil of the ordinary. It was a plant of mystery, half medicine, half sorcery, a companion of both healer and assassin. When the Victorians rediscovered it, they clothed its dangers in elegance. No longer an herb of witchcraft, it became a fashion accessory, a secret cosmetic, admired and whispered about behind lace fans. The language of eyes. Why, you may wonder, were dilated pupils so desirable? The answer lies in the silent poetry of the eyes. To the Victorians, the gaze was everything. Eyes spoke of innocence, of passion, of hidden depths. A woman whose pupils were dark and wide appeared more receptive, more vulnerable, more entrancing. Even earlier, during the Italian Renaissance, painters like Raphael and Botticelli had celebrated women with large, luminous eyes. It was said that in Venice, courtesans and noblewomen alike used belladonna drops to enhance their gaze. Thus, the Victorians were not inventing the practice. They were reviving it, giving it new life in an era obsessed with appearances. Yet, unlike a painting, these were living women. Behind the softened gaze, behind the dreamlike eyes lay headaches, dry mouths, trembling hands, and fragile hearts. The look of innocence came at the cost of health, and often at the cost of clarity itself. Inside the parlors, imagine stepping softly into a Victorian drawing room. The air carries the faint perfume of rose water and lavender sachets. A fire murmurs in the hearth, and the golden haze of gaslight fills the space. On a small table rests a collection of tiny glass bottles, delicate, stoppered, some labeled, others not. Among them lies a vial of belladonna tincture, its liquid dark, almost black. A young woman sits before a mirror, her corset cinched, her hair swept high in gleaming curls. Her maid, quiet and careful, tilts the vial. 2 drops fall gently into each wide, waiting eye. The woman blinks, shivers faintly, then stares into the glass before her. Her pupils widen, consuming the blue of her irises. Her gaze softens, deepens, until she looks less like flesh and blood, and more like a spirit caught in lamplight. This ritual was performed in silence, often in secret. Not all women dared to speak of it. It was a vanity both whispered about and quietly admired. And once seen in the glow of the ballroom, the effect was undeniable. At the ball picture, the scene. A grand Victorian ball. Crystal chandeliers spill light onto polished floors where gowns swish like waves in a silken sea. Music from violins and piano floats into the night air. And there, gliding across the floor, is the woman with belladonna-darkened eyes. Her gaze is vast, dreamy, and haunting. To the men she passes, her presence is magnetic. Her fragility makes her seem untouchable, her pale beauty like moonlight embodied. No one at the ball notices her occasional sway, the faint dizziness, the way she presses her gloved hand to the wall for support when she thinks no one is watching. What they see is only the ghost, and in a world that prized appearances above truth, the ghost was enough. Medical curiosity doctors of the age were both fascinated and disturbed by this practice. In medical journals, some warned of belladonna's effects. They observed how it blurred vision, sometimes permanently. They noted its strain on the heart, its power to drive the mind into delirium if overused. But medicine in the Victorian era was itself full of contradictions. Opium was prescribed freely for sleeplessness, laudanum for grief, arsenic for beauty creams. So belladonna did not seem so unusual. It was simply one more dangerous indulgence in a century where poison and cure often blurred together. For physicians, the women who appeared ghostly and frail were both patients and puzzles. They were drawn in by the strange allure of the drug, even as they cautioned against it. A mirror of society. If we look deeper, this haunting fashion was more than a cosmetic choice. It was a reflection of the values and pressures of the time. Victorian society placed women in a narrow cage of expectations. They were to be delicate, dependent, graceful, and pale. Strength, vitality, and sun-kissed skin, qualities that spoke of labor, were not admired, and so women sought ways to mold themselves into the image demanded of them. If pale powders did not suffice, they reached for stronger methods. If fainting in public was considered attractive, then weakness became a performance. Belladonna, then, was not merely a drug. It was a symbol of society's hunger for women to appear fragile, ghost-like, and ornamental, even at the expense of their very lives. The haunting side effects. The true cost was never hidden for long. Women who relied heavily on belladonna suffered in silence. Some spoke of seeing halos around lights, their vision distorted as though the world had grown dreamlike. Others complained of constant thirst, of dry mouths that no amount of tea or water could soothe. Their hands sometimes shook as they embroidered or poured tea. Their hearts raced or skipped beats, leaving them breathless after a single dance. And, still, they continued. For each glance of admiration, for each whispered compliment of beauty, the risk seemed, if only for a time, worth bearing. Ghosts in literature. This strange fashion did not go unnoticed by writers of the age. Victorian literature is full of pale heroines, fragile maidens, and women described as if they were already half-spirits. They float through pages like specters of beauty, their illnesses romanticized, their frailty mistaken for charm. In some ways, belladonna women became living embodiments of these literary archetypes. They were the pale figures that poets described, but instead of existing only in fiction, they danced in ballrooms and lingered in candlelit parlors. The line between story and reality blurred, until the women themselves seemed like characters, ghosts, drifting across the stage of Victorian life. The whisper of danger. By the late Victorian period, as science advanced and awareness of toxic substances grew, more voices began to speak against the practice. Pharmacists, concerned for their reputations, withdrew belladonna from cosmetic shelves. Medical men urged women to abandon the drops, but the whispers of the ghostly beauty had already etched themselves into memory. And though fewer women continued the practice openly, its legend lingered, part history, part cautionary tale, part fascination. Shifting tides of beauty. As the Victorian era moved into its later decades, fashions began to change. The obsession with extreme paleness slowly softened, and society turned its attention toward different forms of beauty. The rise of photography, for instance, altered ideals. In portraits and carte de visite, too much pallor made subjects appear ghost-like, their faces disappearing into the background. Thus, a touch more color became desirable. Rosy cheeks, a healthier glow. This shift was subtle, but it mattered. As artists and photographers emphasized vitality, the ghostly look of belladonna users began to seem less fashionable and more alarming. The very same hollow fragility that once captivated ballrooms now hinted at illness. Society was learning slowly that beauty might carry consequences. Scandals and rumors, stories of women harmed by belladonna spread quietly, often disguised as gossip. A countess who lost her sight after years of using the drops. A famous singer whose trembling hands betrayed her addiction. A young debutante whose heart failed unexpectedly during a waltz, the whispers pointing not to weak health but to poisoned beauty. Though many of these tales blurred fact and rumor, they fed the growing unease. In drawing rooms and salons, ladies began to ask, "Have you heard?" The drops once considered fashionable were now tinged with scandal. And scandal, in Victorian society, could be far more dangerous than poison. Science steps forward. By the 1870s and 1880s, medical science was advancing rapidly. The microscope opened up new discoveries, and chemical analysis gave doctors clearer insight into substances like belladonna. No longer shrouded in mystery, atropine, the chemical compound at the heart of the plant, was isolated and studied. Doctors documented its effects with precision: the dilation of pupils, the slowing of digestion, the acceleration of heartbeat, the confusion and hallucinations it caused at higher doses. They began using atropine medically, in controlled amounts, to treat eye disorders, muscle spasms, and even to counteract other poisons. The transformation was striking. What had once been a dangerous cosmetic secret now became a legitimate tool in the physician's kit. But this medical use stood in sharp contrast to its reckless application for beauty. One was science, carefully measured. The other was vanity, flirting with death. The gendered risk. It is important to pause here and consider the weight of expectation. Men in the Victorian era were rarely asked to endanger themselves for beauty. Their appearance mattered, yes, but not to the point of risking health. For women, however, the story was different. The ideal of delicate femininity placed them in constant pursuit of appearances. Corsets reshaped their bodies, sometimes crushing ribs or impairing breathing. Tight-laced waists were fainting waists. Lead powders, arsenic wafers, and belladonna drops all worked together to sculpt women into living art pieces, admired yet weakened. Belladonna, in this sense, was not only a drug but a symbol of inequality. It represented the extreme lengths to which women were expected to go, silently, dutifully, even dangerously, for approval in a world where beauty could dictate a woman's entire future. Behind closed doors, not every woman embraced the drug. Of course, for many it was a whispered curiosity rather than a daily ritual. Some tried it once, perhaps on the eve of a grand ball, then set it aside forever after feeling its unsettling effects. Others watched their peers grow frailer and decided against it. But in private, some continued quietly, even when society had begun to turn against the practice. Behind closed curtains, they clung to the illusion the drug created. They saw in the mirror not their own suffering, but the image of what they believed others wanted to see. For these women, belladonna became less about fashion and more about identity. The ghostly gaze was not simply a mask, it became a part of how they understood themselves. And that perhaps was the most haunting cost of all. Writers and satirists, as public opinion shifted, writers and satirists began poking fun at the fad. Caricatures in magazines depicted women with enormous glassy eyes, stumbling about blindly as they clutched fans and fainted dramatically. Comic verses mocked the vanity of those who would risk blindness for beauty. These depictions were not merely humorous. They carried a sting, warning society of the foolishness of dangerous fashion. By laughing at it, the public began to distance itself from the practice. The very thing that once captivated admiration now invited ridicule. The decline of the ghostly gaze. By the end of the 19th century, belladonna as a cosmetic had nearly vanished. Doctors warned too loudly, satirists mocked too cruelly, and society's ideals had shifted toward healthier appearances. Pale fragility gave way to an admiration for vigor, especially as the 20th century dawned. The Edwardian era favored women who looked active, who enjoyed fresh air, cycling, and sports. The ghost once so desirable faded into the shadows, but the memory lingered. Whispers of the women who risked everything for beauty remained in cultural memory, an eerie reminder of how far the pursuit of an ideal could go. Echoes in modern times, though belladonna faded from vanity tables, its legacy echoes in modern beauty standards. Even today, the risks women take for appearance continue. Tight lacing has become cosmetic surgery. Lead powders have become chemical skin lighteners. Dangerous drops have become injections and enhancements, often with risks not fully understood, until years later. The story of belladonna reminds us that the desire for beauty is timeless, and so too are the dangers hidden behind its promises. The ghostly gaze of Victorian women may seem distant, but its shadow stretches forward, whispering caution to us even now. A haunting symbol in the end, belladonna was more than a drug. It was a symbol of an age obsessed with appearances, a silent agreement between society and its women that frailty could be more valuable than strength. It turned parlors into theaters, where women performed ghostliness for admiration. It turned beauty into a quiet tragedy, where health was the price of approval. And though the fad has long since vanished, the image remains. The image of women, drifting through candlelit halls with wide, dark eyes, pale as moonlight, fragile as mist. Living ghosts, admired and forgotten, their beauty both haunting and haunted. A Lady of London, one of the most whispered tales, comes from London's high society. A baroness, her name concealed in polite records but hinted at in private letters, was known for her unforgettable eyes. At every gathering her gaze lingered, like a spell. Her pupils were vast, her stare dreamlike, as if she looked at the world through a veil of mist. But those who knew her closely saw something else. She often stumbled when walking, misjudging the distance of steps. She squinted at her embroidery, the thread slipping from her needle as her sight faltered. Servants reported that she spent mornings in darkness, her eyes unable to bear the sun's light. In time, her vision deteriorated. Though never formally declared blind, she lived in near perpetual twilight, her beauty preserved only in memory. The very gaze that once captivated society became her downfall, proof that even privilege could not shield one from the cruelty of the drug. A seamstress's secret far from grand ballrooms, the drug reached humbler homes. In the industrial districts of Manchester and Birmingham, working women also felt the weight of beauty's demands. A young seamstress, recorded in a medical journal of the 1860s, confessed to using belladonna drops before outings. Her wages were modest, but a small vial could last weeks. She longed to appear more refined, to mimic the ladies she saw in illustrated fashion plates. When she looked into the mirror after applying the drops, she felt, just for a moment, that she belonged to that higher world. But her doctor, who treated her for persistent dizziness, noted her pulse was irregular, her eyes strained. He wrote that she was enslaved by vanity, though perhaps he failed to see the deeper truth. She was enslaved by a society that judged her worth not by her skill at sewing, but by the wideness of her eyes. Doctors take notice as stories accumulated. Physicians began documenting cases with greater seriousness. The British Medical Journal in the mid-19th century contained scattered references to women suffering from nightshade poisoning of a cosmetic nature. Symptoms ranged from blurred vision to hallucinations, from palpitations to prolonged fainting spells. One report told of a woman who experienced vivid dreams after using the drops, dreams so real she believed herself pursued by spirits. Her family, alarmed, thought her mad until a physician recognized the cause. He recommended cessation of the drug, though by then her sight never fully returned. Another case described a patient whose heart raced to such extremes that she could not climb stairs without collapsing. When questioned, she admitted to using belladonna before every social gathering for nearly a decade. These clinical accounts stripped away the glamour, revealing the stark medical truth behind the ghostly beauty. The mirror of morality moralists of the age seized upon these reports as lessons. Pamphlets warned young women against vanity, framing belladonna not only as a poison to the body, but a corruption of the soul. To endanger one's health for appearance, they argued, was a form of selfishness, a sign of weak character. Yet these arguments missed the deeper injustice. The very same society that condemned women for using dangerous cosmetics also demanded they appear beautiful and delicate at all costs. The scolding of moralists only added another layer of burden, turning private desperation into public shame. The artist's eye. Not all observers condemned. Some artists and poets, fascinated by the eerie effect, recorded it in prose and painting. One painter described sitting for a portrait of a young woman who had used the drops. He wrote of her eyes as dark lakes reflecting candlelight, eyes not wholly belonging to the living. To him, the effect was not vanity, it was art. He compared her gaze to muses of myth, women who bridged the mortal and the ethereal. Though he painted her likeness faithfully, he noted that as she sat, her hand trembled against her lap, and he wondered how long she could maintain her pose. The resulting portrait, critics remarked, held a haunting beauty, yet the painter himself could not forget the human frailty that lay beneath the illusion. A symbol in society. By the late Victorian years, belladonna's role as a cosmetic had become both infamous and symbolic. It stood for excess, for the dangers of pursuing beauty at any cost. Writers referenced it in novels as a shorthand for vanity or deceit. Satirists invoked it when mocking women who chased fashion blindly. And yet, it also lingered as a symbol of tragic allure. The belladonna gaze became a phrase in poems, a way to describe women who were both enchanting and doomed. It was at once warning and fascination, condemnation and longing. Quiet retreat. Most women abandoned the drug quietly, slipping their tiny vials into drawers and forgetting them. Some replaced it with safer tricks, dabbing glycerin on lips for shine, using rouge for a touch of color, or simply trusting the candlelight to soften their features. The fad receded not with a crash but like mist dissolving in morning sun. By the dawn of the 20th century, few remembered the ghostly eyes that once bewitched ballrooms. Belladonna had returned to the domain of medicine, leaving behind only its legend. Ghosts of memory, even so, echoes lingered. Old women, recalling their youth, sometimes whispered of the drops they once tried, their voices tinged with nostalgia and regret. Writers of the early 1900s mentioned the practice in essays about the follies of our mother's age. And in the cultural imagination, the ghostly Victorian woman endured, Wide-eyed, pale, fragile, a haunting figure both romanticized and pitied. Thus the story of belladonna is not merely about a plant, nor even about a fashion. It is about the strange power of beauty, the dangers of expectation, and the haunting truths hidden in history's quieter corners. Beyond Victorian Britain, though belladonna was most famously tied to the parlors and ballrooms of Victorian England, the longing for fragile, ghostly beauty was not confined to that island. All across Europe, similar practices emerged, each culture shaping the ideal of beauty in its own peculiar and often perilous ways. In Paris, the city of fashion and salons, cosmetic sellers offered tinctures not unlike belladonna. Though French society admired a livelier elegance than the English, pale skin and soft dark eyes were still coveted traits. In Italy, the very birthplace of the drug's name, echoes of Renaissance practices persisted quietly among noble families. And in Vienna's grand opera houses, the haunting gaze of women with darkened pupils was whispered of behind velvet curtains. The fad, though not universal, carried with it a strange international allure, evidence that the hunger for beauty knows few borders. Across the Atlantic, even in America, echoes of the fad could be found. By the mid-19th century, American women were avid consumers of imported cosmetics and European fashions. Magazines such as Godey's Ladies' Book reported on beauty trends overseas, sometimes warning, sometimes admiring. Though belladonna drops were never as widespread in the United States as in Europe, doctors did note their occasional use among society women in New York and Boston. Travelers brought back stories of European ladies with eyes like dark moons, and some women sought to replicate the effect. The American ideal of beauty tended to favor a more robust vitality, yet even there, whispers of the ghostly gaze took hold in private corners of parlors and dressing rooms. Dangerous beauty across cultures. The story of belladonna belongs to a broader human pattern. Throughout history, cultures have embraced practices that placed appearance above safety. In ancient Rome, women whitened their faces with powders containing lead. Centuries later, Venetian women of the Renaissance used both belladonna and mercury-based cosmetics. In Japan, the art of ohaguro, the blackening of teeth, was practiced for centuries, using mixtures that slowly corroded enamel but were considered beautiful and dignified. In China, foot binding shaped women's bodies into the delicate forms demanded by custom at the cost of pain and mobility. And in more recent times, arsenic wafers were marketed in Europe and America as beauty tablets, promising clear skin while slowly poisoning the body. When seen in this larger context, the Victorian ghostly gaze becomes part of a tapestry, a global history of beauty bound up with suffering, the universal thread. Why do such practices emerge again and again? The answer lies in the power of ideals. When society declares one look to be the standard of desirability, individuals are often willing to risk health to achieve it. In the Victorian era, the ideal was fragility, ghostliness, and delicate femininity. In other places and times it has been different. Strength, plumpness, thinness, whiteness, darkness, or adornment. But the pattern is the same. The body is reshaped, constrained, or poisoned to meet expectations that change like the seasons. The tale of belladonna, then, is not merely Victorian, it is human, a mirror reflecting back the timeless struggle between individuality and conformity, health and appearance, truth and illusion. The role of secrecy. One detail that makes the belladonna fad especially haunting is the secrecy that surrounded. Twice unlike rouge or powders, which could be purchased openly, the drops were used quietly, often hidden from husbands, fathers, or even friends. The secrecy created an intimacy between women and the drug itself. A vial tucked into a drawer became a private companion, a guilty indulgence known only to its owner. This secrecy also preserved the illusion. Men admired the ghostly gaze without knowing what caused it, and women whispered of it without confessing their own use. The hidden nature of the practice gave it a mystical quality, half forbidden, half magical, strengthening its hold over those who dared to use it. The fear of exposure with secrecy came fear. What if others discovered the truth? What if a maid whispered to another household that her mistress used the deadly drops? What if a doctor revealed the cause of her illness to the wrong ears? In a society obsessed with reputation, exposure could be disastrous. The danger was not only physical but social, and so many women lived with double shadows. The shadow of poison within their bodies, and the shadow of shame that hovered if their secret were revealed. This dual burden added another layer of ghostliness, as if these women were already living, half in the world of appearances, half in the world of silence. A wider reflection, as the 19th century waned and the 20th began, historians and cultural critics started to reflect on the peculiar habits of the age. Writers looking back at the Victorian period described it as both dignified and absurd, a time of strict morality paired with dangerous vanities. Belladonna became a symbol in these reflections, not only of beauty's peril, but of the contradictions of the era itself. An age that prized reason and progress had also embraced poison for fashion. An era that built railways and telegraphs still whispered of witches' plants in boudoirs. The ghostly gaze encapsulated the strange duality of the century, modernity clothed in superstition, elegance balanced on the edge of harm. Lessons for the future. Though the fad faded, its lessons lingered. Medical writers of the early 20th century often cited belladonna as a warning when new cosmetics emerged. Whenever a new cream, pill, or drop promised miraculous transformation, doctors reminded readers of the ghostly ladies of the last century. And indeed, the warnings proved prescient. The 20th century would bring its own dangerous fads: radium face creams that glowed in the dark, diet pills laced with amphetamines, silicone injections that led to illness. The pattern repeated, echoing the past. Belladonna's story, remembered, in fragments and whispers, became part of this ongoing cautionary tale. Beauty is never free, and sometimes the price is far too high. Echoes in memoirs. Though few women openly admitted to using belladonna, traces of its presence linger in memoirs and diaries. A journal entry from a young London woman, dated 1858, describes the curious vial upon my dressing table, lent me by a friend, which grants to the eyes a strange soft brilliance. She writes of hesitation, noting her mother's warnings, yet confesses, "I tried it once before the dance, and the gaze it gave me was remarked upon by all. My suitor said I looked touched by moonlight." Her words capture the mixture of thrill and fear. She knew the vial carried danger, but she could not resist the validation it brought. The entry ends on a haunting note. "Yet my eyes ached terribly after, and I slept little. I shall not use it often, or so I hope." Another recollection, preserved in an unpublished letter from a governess, speaks of tending to her employer's daughter after fainting spells. The young woman, pale and trembling, confessed through tears that she had been using the drops to impress a potential match. The governess described feeling torn, sympathy for the girl, anger at the expectation placed upon her, and fear that silence would cost her health. She wrote, "The eyes of that child seemed not her own, but the eyes of a spirit, and I could not help but shiver." Literature's ghostly women, the belladonna gaze slipped quietly into the pages of fiction. Victorian novels abounded with heroines, described as pale, wide-eyed, and fragile, though authors rarely admitted the artificial cause. In sensation novels, where mystery and scandal ruled, the unnatural gaze of a woman sometimes hinted at hidden vice or secret despair. Poets wrote of maidens with nightshade eyes, a phrase that carried double meaning: beauty tinged with danger. In Gothic tales, where the line between life and death blurred, the belladonna effect found a natural home. Writers compared women to wraiths, angels, or spirits, their beauty luminous yet ominous. Though the specific practice was rarely spelled out, the imagery was unmistakable. Women who looked like ghosts because society asked them to. The Gothic. Imagination by the fin de siècle, the end of the century, Victorian culture was steeped in Gothic fascination. Ghost stories, spiritualist seances, and tales of haunted houses filled magazines and drawing rooms. The image of a pale woman with vast, dark eyes fitted seamlessly into this atmosphere. Belladonna beauty became part of the collective imagination, not a fashion statement, but a haunting archetype. It resonated with cultural anxieties about the blurred boundaries between life and death, science and superstition, natural and unnatural. Some ghost stories even described female spirits with eyes so wide they seemed to drink the soul, mirroring the real-world look created by the drops. In fiction, what had once been fashion became symbol. Beauty as danger, allure as death's companion. Artistic interpretations, painters and illustrators of the era also echoed the aesthetic. The pre-Raphaelites, with their fascination for ethereal, women and tragic heroines, painted figures with gazes that seemed impossibly wide and dreamy. Though not all were inspired directly by Belladonna, the similarity was striking. The art of Dante Gabriel Rossetti or John Everett Millais often portrayed women whose beauty carried an undertone of fragility, almost ghostliness. Later, illustrators for Gothic novels exaggerated the look further, giving heroines eyes like dark moons, surrounded by pale skin, reinforcing the connection between beauty and spectral presence. Satire and dark humor, even as the aesthetic seeped into art and literature, satirists sharpened their pens. Magazines like Punch published cartoons of ladies with comically enormous eyes, stumbling into furniture, or mistaking their dance partners due to poor sight. One quip read, "She sees him not as he is, but as her belladonna makes him, blurred, and fairer than truth." These satirical pieces reveal society's ambivalence, admiration laced with ridicule, fascination paired with disapproval. The ghostly gaze was beautiful, yes, but it was also absurd, a folly to be mocked. Belladonna as metaphor by the early 20th century, even after the cosmetic use had faded, belladonna endured as metaphor. Writers invoked it as shorthand for deceptive allure, beauty that charms but conceals danger. A woman with belladonna eyes was not simply beautiful, she was haunting, perhaps untrustworthy, perhaps tragic. This metaphorical life outlasted the fad itself. In poems, plays, and later cinema, the phrase carried weight far beyond the plant's toxic chemistry. It became a cultural symbol of beauty entwined with death. The science of fear at the same time. Scientists continued to study belladonna. By understanding its chemistry, they transformed it from a dangerous cosmetic into a legitimate medical tool. Atropine became standard in ophthalmology, used to dilate pupils for eye examinations. Ironically, the very effect once sought for vanity now served a practical clinical purpose. Doctors, however, could never quite forget its other history. Medical textbooks of the early 20th century often included a cautionary note. Formerly employed by women as a cosmetic, with perilous consequences. The ghost of Victorian vanity haunted even the most scientific of pages. Shadows in popular memory. As decades passed, stories of belladonna beauty survived mostly in fragments, anecdotes told by grandmothers, passages in forgotten novels, lines in dusty medical texts. Yet those fragments accumulated into a shadowy legend. By the time Gothic revival writers of the 20th century looked back on the Victorians, the ghostly woman with darkened eyes had become emblematic. She was not merely a historical curiosity, she was an archetype, a figure who embodied the haunting costs of vanity and societal expectation. The Victorian obsession with death. No century before or after has been quite so fascinated by death as the Victorian era. It was a time of mourning rituals, elaborate funerals, and entire industries devoted to grief. Families commissioned post-mortem, photographs dressing the deceased as if still alive. Women wore mourning black for years, sometimes for life, to honor lost husbands or children. This fixation with death was not merely cultural, it was deeply personal. With high mortality rates, especially among the young, nearly every household bore the shadow of loss. And from this shadow arose spiritualism, seances, mediums, and attempts to contact the departed. In such a world, the belladonna gaze fit naturally. A woman who looked ghost-like, her eyes vast and dream-filled, seemed already halfway between the living and the dead. Her beauty mirrored the era's longing to reach beyond the veil. Seances and the ghostly gaze seances became popular evening entertainments in both London and America. Families gathered in candlelit parlors, hands joined around tables waiting for spirits to rap on wood or flicker candles. Mediums, often women, acted as the bridge between worlds. Descriptions of these mediums frequently include their eyes, wide, luminous, entrancing. Though not all used belladonna, the aesthetic was strikingly similar. Witnesses described them as looking possessed of otherworldly vision, their gazes fixed beyond the present, as if seeing what others could not. It is tempting to imagine that some mediums may have enhanced this effect deliberately. A few drops in the eyes before a seance could deepen the illusion of ghostliness, convincing clients that the woman truly communed with spirits. Whether or not this was common practice, the resemblance between the belladonna look and the spiritualist's gaze was uncanny. The angel in the room, the Victorians were deeply enamored with the image of the fragile, otherworldly woman. In art, she appeared as the angel in the house, pure, selfless, almost ethereal. In literature, she drifted like a spirit, her beauty inseparable from her frailty. In spiritualism, she became the vessel through which voices from beyond might speak. Belladonna turned this image into reality, giving women the eyes of angels, the pallor of ghosts, the presence of something not wholly earthly. It blurred the line between ideal and illusion, between mortal and supernatural. Beauty as apparition. Consider the atmosphere of a Victorian drawing room during a séance. Candles flicker low. The air feels heavy, scented faintly with wax and perfume. The medium closes her eyes, then opens them slowly, eyes dark, wide, glowing faintly in the candlelight. She whispers of spirits, her voice soft and trembling. For those gathered, the experience was electrifying. The medium did not merely speak of ghosts. She looked like one. Her beauty was not fleshly, but spectral. Whether through natural effect or aided by belladonna, her presence embodied the uncanny. Fear and desire, this ghostly allure carried both fascination and fear. Men admired women with belladonna eyes, yet often spoke of them as unsettling, too intense, even dangerous. The very qualities that drew attention also evoked unease. This duality, desire mingled with dread, was central to Victorian culture. Death was romanticized but terrifying. Femininity was worshipped but controlled. Beauty was praised but feared. The belladonna gaze embodied all these contradictions in one haunting expression. Medical men and the supernatural doctors sometimes found themselves drawn unwillingly into this world of blurred boundaries. Reports exist of physicians attending seances, not only to debunk but also to study. Some wrote with skepticism, others with reluctant fascination. One doctor described a medium whose eyes appeared unnaturally enlarged, with pupils so dark as to efface the iris. He attributed the effect to belladonna, but admitted that in the dim light the result was most convincing of otherworldly communion. Thus even science could not entirely escape the drug's spectral spell. The gaze that once bewitched, ballrooms now bewitched séance circles, equally tied to beauty and belief. The Gothic stage. The theater too embraced the ghostly aesthetic. In productions of Gothic plays, adaptations of Frankenstein, Dracula, and penny dreadful tales, actresses often portrayed pale, haunted heroines with eyes that seemed impossibly wide. Some costumers whispered of actresses using belladonna to heighten the effect under the footlights. An actress with dilated pupils could hold the audience in thrall, her gaze appearing both hypnotic and tragic. Though proof is scarce, the rumor persisted, entwining the drug with performance and illusion. In this way, belladonna crossed from parlors to stages, from private beauty ritual to public spectacle. Cultural symbolism. By the end of the century, belladonna was no longer just a cosmetic, nor merely a poison. It was a symbol, a shorthand for beauty haunted by death, allure entwined with danger. Poets invoked it to describe women whose charm was both captivating and destructive. Novelists used it as metaphor for deception or fatal love. Even in spiritualist writings, the phrase belladonna eyes appeared, suggesting not only physical beauty, but supernatural vision. The plant itself became a cultural ghost, its shadow, woven into art, literature, theater, and memory. Between beauty and the beyond in truth, the ghostly gaze of belladonna reveals how thin the line was between fashion and the supernatural in the Victorian world. What began as a beauty fad evolved into something much larger, a reflection of the era's obsession with fragility, death, and the unseen. Women who used the drug became more than participants in a fashion. They became living symbols, embodying the very mysteries their culture adored: the fragile body, the haunted spirit, the allure of the unknown. And whether admired in ballrooms, feared in drawing rooms, or gazed upon in theaters, they carried with them the same haunting truth, that beauty in Victorian times was not only a standard to be reached, but a ghost to be pursued. The fading of a dangerous fashion. As the new century dawned, scientific progress and shifting fashions gradually pushed belladonna cosmetics into obscurity. Doctors grew louder in their warnings. Health reformers, armed with pamphlets and public lectures, condemned the practice as vanity paid for in pain, and new beauty ideals emerged. The fresh, athletic new woman with rosy cheeks and clear eyes replaced the fragile, ghostly maiden of the Victorian age. Yet though the bottles of poison were discarded, the memory of the look remained. The ghostly gaze of the Victorian woman lingered, ready to be reborn in new forms. The Gothic revival in culture. Even as society modernized, fascination with Gothic themes never vanished. The fin de siècle, those last decadent decades of the 19th century, bled into the early 20th with a renewed hunger for ghost stories, supernatural novels, and dark romance. Writers such as Bram Stoker had already etched the image of the pale, haunted woman into the Gothic imagination. In Dracula, the vampiric Lucy Westenra is described with eyes that appear unearthly, luminous in death. Though Stoker does not mention belladonna, the resemblance is undeniable. Her ghostly transformation mirrors the Victorian association between enlarged, glowing eyes and the uncanny. Ghost stories in magazines carried forward the trope. Pale women, at windows dark-eyed and tragic, drifting like shadows. Even after the drug fell from fashion, its aesthetic lived on as a literary device. Early cinema and the ghostly look, the invention of motion pictures, gave new life to this haunting beauty. Silent films, particularly Gothic adaptations and early horror, leaned heavily on visual exaggeration. Actresses often painted their eyes darkly to appear wider on camera, evoking the same spectral effect as belladonna. In films like Nosferatu, 1922, and later Dracula, 1931, female characters embodied the fragile, haunted allure that Victorians once pursued with poison. The camera adored large, luminous eyes, which could convey emotion even without spoken words. Though makeup now achieved the look safely, the ghostly impression remained the same. Women caught between beauty and otherworldliness. Some film historians note that actresses like Theda Bara, famous for playing vamps, styled their gazes to appear hypnotic, mysterious, and dangerous. Though these portrayals were theatrical, they echoed the same cultural thread that belladonna had once woven into Victorian life. The symbolic transformation. By this time, belladonna was more symbol than substance, no longer a tool in the vanity box. It had become a metaphor that artists, writers, and filmmakers wielded with intent. A belladonna gaze meant more than dilated pupils. It suggested danger wrapped in beauty, a woman whose allure carried a shadow. This transformation was essential. The drug itself disappeared, but the ghost it created endured. The aesthetic outlived the practice, slipping into archetypes and artistic tropes that still haunt us today. Medicine reclaims the plant. Meanwhile, science had claimed belladonna for its own. Atropine, its active alkaloid, became a staple in medical practice. Eye doctors used it to dilate pupils for examinations, echoing, ironically, the very cosmetic effect that once endangered women. Beyond ophthalmology, Atropine served in treating heart conditions, calming muscle spasms, and even as an antidote for certain poisons. Thus, what had once been a dangerous vanity found redemption in healing. Yet doctors never forgot its darker history. Textbooks of the early 20th century carried stern reminders, formerly employed as a cosmetic by women, often with disastrous results. The ghost of fashion lingered even in the margins of medical science, folklore, and whispered legends. Even as the plant entered hospitals, its folklore endured in villages and households. Older generations whispered tales of ladies who turned themselves into phantoms with drops from a deadly flower. Children heard warnings never to touch berries in the hedgerows, lest they be claimed by the witch's plant. Some rural folk still referred to it as the devil's berry, or deadly nightshade, attaching stories of women who sought beauty but found death. These tales, half remembered, kept alive the link between belladonna and vanity, even as actual use faded into history. The romantic haunting. The ghostly woman with darkened eyes evolved into a romantic archetype across the arts. Poets of the early 20th century continued to use the image of belladonna eyes as a metaphor for fatal beauty. Painters and illustrators rendered pale heroines with luminous gazes that seemed to look beyond the veil. The association was so strong that, by mid-century, even perfumes and fashion lines borrowed the name belladonna to suggest danger, mystery, and allure. The drug's deadly history had been transformed into aesthetic branding, a haunting, alluring echo of its past. Echoes in the occult revival movements of the early 20th century also adopted belladonna imagery. Some ritual texts mentioned the plant in relation to trance and vision, though rarely for cosmetic use. Its ghostly reputation made it a natural symbol in circles fascinated by the supernatural. For spiritualists and occultists, the idea of a flower that could open the eyes wider, literally and symbolically, was too compelling to ignore. It fit perfectly with the era's fascination for altered states, hidden worlds, and the thin veil between living and dead. The lasting archetype. By the time the Victorian era was firmly in the past, belladonna had ceased to be a tool of fashion. Yet the ghost it created walked on, in novels, plays, films, art, and whispered folklore. The pale woman with vast haunted eyes became a cultural figure larger than the drug itself. She represented vanity, fragility, beauty, and death all at once. Her gaze belonged equally to the ballroom, the seance, and the cinema screen. Even today, the phrase belladonna beauty conjures not health, but haunting allure. Closing the curtain on the erethus, though the dangerous practice faded, its imprint endured. Victorian women who once risked blindness for a glance of admiration left behind more than warnings. They gave the world an archetype, a vision of beauty touched by death. And while the drug itself retreated to the safety of laboratories and clinics, its cultural ghost still lingers. Every time we imagine a haunted heroine, a pale figure with wide, entrancing eyes, we echo those forgotten women who, for a moment of admiration, became living ghosts in their own age. The ghost walks into cinema. By the mid-20th century, horror cinema had matured into a genre all its own. Films such as Dracula, Frankenstein, Rebecca, and The Innocents captured audiences with visions of pale women haunted by inner or outer demons. The camera lingered on their faces, especially their eyes, wide, trembling, radiant in the gloom. This was no accident. Cinematographers knew that a gaze, lit carefully, could evoke fear, pity, or enchantment. Though actresses no longer needed belladonna to achieve this effect, makeup artists and lighting designers recreated its essence. Dark liner, pale powder, and shadows gave the illusion of enlarged pupils, echoing the Victorian obsession without the poison. Audiences responded with the same uneasy fascination as their 19th century forebears. The spectral woman on screen was both beautiful and unsettling, her eyes an invitation into a realm not entirely safe. Hitchcock and the haunted eye. Few directors understood the power of eyes as well as Alfred Hitchcock. In films like Vertigo and Psycho, the camera focused intently on female characters' gazes. Though the stories were modern, Their roots reached back to the Victorian archetype, women whose eyes seemed to hold secrets, danger, or despair. Actresses, such as Tippi Hedren and Janet Leigh, wore makeup that exaggerated the size of their eyes. In the dim glow of black and white film, this effect recalled the ghostly belladonna look. The audience might not have recognized the historical connection, but the image tapped into something ancient, our cultural memory of the haunted gaze. Literature keeps the memory. Alive writers, too, carried the belladonna ghost into the 20th century. Gothic novels and modernist poetry alike employed the metaphor of poisonous beauty, or eyes like midnight flowers. Though the plant itself was rarely used, its symbolic weight endured. Sylvia Plath, in her poetry, described eyes as darkening mirrors. Anne Sexton wrote of beauty bound to fragility. While neither named belladonna, the echoes of that dangerous bloom lingered between their lines. In Gothic romance novels, pale heroines with dark eyes remained staples of the genre. Readers recognized the type instantly. The haunted beauty, descended from the Victorian ghost woman belladonna in popular culture. By the mid-century, belladonna had become a word used not only in medicine or botany, but in marketing, and art. Perfumes bore the name, suggesting danger and allure in a single breath. Fashion lines evoked it to sell dresses with a dark, romantic edge. Even rock bands adopted the name, weaving its mystique into music. Here the plant became pure symbol, detached from its original cosmetic use, yet powerful in cultural imagination. To say something was belladonna meant it was beautiful, mysterious, and slightly dangerous. The rise of Gothic subculture. By the late 20th century, Gothic subculture had emerged from the shadows of punk and post-punk music. Bands such as Bauhaus and Susie and the Banshees drew on imagery of pale faces, darkened eyes, and ghostly aesthetics. Though few in the subculture knew the history of Victorian cosmetics, the look they embraced bore striking resemblance. The pale foundation, the widened, darkened eyes, the ghost-like presence, all echoed the same haunting beauty that belladonna once created. In Gothic clubs and concerts, young men and women became living phantoms, resurrecting the ghostly gaze without poison. The aesthetic had outlived the practice, finding new expression in music, fashion, and art. Horror and the eternal gaze horror films of the late 20th century, The Exorcist, Carrie, The Others, often lingered on eyes to convey possession, terror, or trance. The cinematic tradition of the haunted gaze became a staple, inherited directly from Victorian imagery. Audiences still shivered at the sight of dark, wide eyes staring beyond reason. The effect, whether achieved with lighting, contact lenses, or makeup, continued to draw on the same cultural thread. The ghostly woman, beautiful and terrifying, remained at the heart of Gothic storytelling. Modern science and the legacy, meanwhile, medical science had long since embraced atropine as a tool, divorced from vanity. Eye doctors still used it to dilate pupils. Emergency rooms used it to counteract certain toxins. Yet even in sterile medical settings, patients sometimes remarked on the eerie appearance it created. A person with dilated pupils sitting under bright lights seemed ghost-like. Doctors might chuckle at the association, but unknowingly they were brushing against centuries of cultural memory. Contemporary fascination today, belladonna remains deeply woven into art, literature, and internet culture. Dark academia and Gothic aesthetics often invoke its name. Artists paint women with wide, dark eyes, framing them in candlelight or shadow. Novelists describe haunted heroines with belladonna eyes, shorthand for beauty tinged with danger. On social media, fascination with Victorian oddities thrives. Posts about bizarre beauty practices, arsenic wafers, corsets, belladonna drops, circulate widely. The story of women who risked death to look ghostly still captivates modern audiences, perhaps because it speaks to the eternal tension between beauty and danger. The haunting that never ends in the end, belladonna's ghost is not confined to the Victorian age. It walks with us still, In the films we watch, the poems we read, the fashions we wear, every pale heroine on a screen, every Gothic painting of a wide-eyed figure, every whispered story of fatal beauty carries its echo. The women who once risked blindness for a moment's admiration may be gone, but the archetype they embodied has survived them. Their ghostly gaze lives on, reshaped for each new age, haunting us as surely as it haunted their own. The modern storyteller's lantern tonight. As you listen in calm stillness, you are part of a chain of storytellers stretching back centuries. Victorian women once whispered these same tales by candlelight. Before them, Renaissance courtiers shared rumors of enchanted potions, and before even that, villagers huddled by fires, murmuring about witches who plucked berries by moonlight. Each generation has passed the story of belladonna forward, reshaping it to fit the fears and fascinations of their time. Now in this gentle ASMR moment, the ghost still lingers, quiet as a breath, alive in the rhythm of words. The psychological shadow. Why does the image of the ghostly woman linger so strongly? Psychologists suggest that the allure of wide, dark eyes comes from deep within our instincts. Dilated pupils often signal attraction, interest, or heightened emotion. To see them in another is to feel a subtle pull, a connection beyond words. Yet when pupils are too wide, the effect shifts. No longer humanly natural, it becomes uncanny. Beauty tips into eeriness. The familiar face seems distant, otherworldly. This tension between allure and unease explains why Victorians sought the look and why it continues to captivate us today. The belladonna gaze, in this sense, is more than cosmetic. It is a mirror of human longing, the wish to be desired, the wish to be remembered, even if it means walking the edge of danger. Beauty and danger, intertwined. Throughout history, cultures have entwined beauty with sacrifice. From crushed gemstones in Cleopatra's eyeliner to lead-based powders in Elizabethan courts, the pursuit of allure has often carried hidden costs. Belladonna was one of the most extreme examples, but it was not alone. The story resonates because it is universal. It reminds us that beauty has always been haunted by danger, whether through toxic ingredients, restrictive clothing, or impossible ideals. And yet, generation after generation, people return to the flame, willing to risk much for the fleeting power of appearance. In this way, belladonna is both a plant and a parable. Its poison teaches not only about danger, but about the lengths we travel in search of admiration. The story's transformation. By the 21st century, the tale of belladonna had transformed into something almost mythic. No longer a warning confined to dusty medical journals, it became a cultural symbol. Writers, filmmakers, and artists still draw upon it, crafting ghostly heroines and dangerous beauties. But the tone has shifted. Where Victorians spoke with a mixture of secrecy and scandal, modern storytellers explore the theme with compassion. We no longer laugh at the vanity of women who used poison for beauty. Instead, we see their humanity, their yearning to belong in a society that judged them by fragile standards. This shift turns the story from condemnation to empathy. It is no longer about folly, but about the cost of living in a world where appearances often determined survival. ASMR as a modern seance. Think of this story now as a kind of seance, though not in the Victorian sense of table rapping and whispered spirits. Rather, it is a gentle invocation of memory. As you listen, you breathe life into the ghosts of history, those Victorian women with their glimmering, haunted eyes. They are not here to frighten, but to be remembered. The soft cadence of ASMR storytelling becomes the lantern that guides them back into presence. The whispers of rustling leaves, the glow of imagined candles, the hush of night air. These are the stage upon which the story performs itself once again. Thus, the strange Victorian drug and the women who once used it live on not only in history, books, but in the intimate quiet of your listening, the everlasting archetype. Even today, when you watch a Gothic film or see an illustration of a pale heroine, you are seeing the imprint of belladonna's legacy. Every time a poet describes eyes like midnight or a filmmaker frames a pale face in candlelight, the ghostly aesthetic returns. The archetype endures because it speaks to something timeless in us, the allure of the mysterious, the beauty that slips beyond the ordinary, the reminder that every shimmer of attraction may conceal a shadow. It is an archetype that needs no poison now, only imagination. Belladonna, in the present today, the plant itself grows quietly in hedgerows and gardens, its berries dark and dangerous, its leaves rich with ancient memory. Doctors still use its derivatives. Herbalists with caution whisper its name as one of the baneful herbs. But in popular imagination, belladonna is not a plant to touch. It is a symbol to ponder. It appears in novels of dark academia, in perfumes named to suggest mystery, in artwork that revels in haunted beauty. Its ghost walks gently but unmistakably through modern culture. The final drift into calm as our journey nears its close. Imagine once more the quiet Victorian parlor. The candles burn low. A woman sits at her mirror, a small vial before her. She hesitates. Beauty on one side, danger on the other. We know her choice, and we know its cost. But we also know that her story has not ended. It lives on. Reshaped, with each retelling, softened into legend, carried into the present by storytellers and dreamers. Tonight, as you rest, you carry the memory forward too. The strange Victorian drug that turned women into living ghosts may be gone, but the haunting beauty it created drifts on, in art, in imagination, and in the calm quiet of stories shared at bedtime. Closing whisper, so let the story settle into silence like a candle flame dimming into embers. Let the echoes of the ghostly gaze soften into calm. And as you drift into sleep, remember, some ghosts do not frighten. They simply remind us to see beauty with gentler eyes. Good night, dear listener. Good night. The Garden of Ghostly Plants. Close your eyes, dear listener, and imagine stepping into a midnight garden. The air is cool, touched by a drifting fog. Moonlight paints the leaves silver, and the earth smells of damp soil. But this is no ordinary garden. It is a gathering of plants that whisper secrets, each one dangerous, each one bound to myth. At the center stands belladonna, her dark berries gleaming like eyes in the shadows. But she is not alone. Around her grow other baneful sisters, each with her own tale of beauty, power, and peril. Hemlock. The philosopher's end first. In a shaded corner we see hemlock, tall, delicate, with clusters of white flowers. Its appearance is innocent, but its history is marked by tragedy. In ancient Greece, hemlock was the poison used to end the life of Socrates. The philosopher drank the fatal draught calmly, his pupils said, as if stepping into a final meditation. The plant became forever linked to questions of wisdom, mortality, and fate. Like belladonna, hemlock looks deceptively harmless, a lesson wrapped in beauty. To see it swaying gently in the breeze is to remember how fragile the line is between life and death. Mandrake, the root that screams. Near the hemlock, tangled in the soil, grows mandrake. Its leaves sprawl low, but the magic lies beneath, in the human-shaped root. Legends told that when pulled from the earth, mandrake screamed, a cry so terrible it could kill the one who heard it. To protect themselves, gatherers tied a dog to the plant. The animal would tug it free, sparing the human but costing its own life. Mandrake, like belladonna, was used in witchcraft and medicine alike. Its roots brewed into potions, its myths woven into fear. Some whispered that it brought fertility, others that it cursed those who touched it. And yet, in its strangeness it carried the same allure, a plant both feared and desired. Datura, the moonflower's madness. Further along the garden path, pale flowers unfurl their trumpet-like blooms under the moon. This is datura, sometimes called devil's trumpet or moonflower. Its blossoms open at night, filling the air with a heady, intoxicating scent. For centuries, it has been both medicine and menace. In India, it was offered to Shiva in ritual. In the Americas, it was used in vision quests and spiritual ceremonies. But its seeds and flowers contain powerful toxins, hallucinogenic, disorienting, dangerous. Stories abound of datura leading people into trances, visions, or madness. Like belladonna, it walks the thin line between healing and harm, beauty and terror. Henbane, the forgotten sister. Beside datura grows henbane, less known but equally perilous. Its yellow-green flowers streaked with purple veins seem almost bruised, as if the plant itself bore secrets of suffering. In medieval Europe, henbane was part of the witch's flying ointment, a salve said to allow flight through hallucinatory journeys. It was also used, dangerously, as an anesthetic in surgery before safer methods were discovered. To encounter henbane is to feel a shiver. It belongs to the same deadly family as belladonna, the nightshades, all bound together by poison and legend. Circle of poison and beauty here in this midnight garden, the plants stand like ancient guardians. Hemlock, philosopher's bane. Mandrake, the screaming root. Datura, the moonflower of madness. Henbane, the witch's ointment. And belladonna, the ghost maker. Each of them teaches the same lesson, whispered in different voices. That beauty and death often walk hand in hand. That allure can conceal danger. That the natural world is filled with mysteries not easily tamed. The witch's cauldron, imagine now. The flicker of a firelight beyond the hedges. A circle of figures gathers. A coven, perhaps, or simply wise women who kept the old ways alive. Into their cauldron they drop leaves, roots, and berries. The smoke rises, fragrant yet unsettling. The potion may heal, may harm, may transport the drinker into visions. To the outside world, these women were feared, accused of witchcraft. But to those who knew, they were keepers of hidden knowledge, protectors of lore passed down through generations. Belladonna was often named among their ingredients, not because it made them fly, but because it altered perception, creating the sensation of drifting beyond the body, of seeing visions in the dark. Even if much of the lore was exaggerated by fearful neighbors and inquisitors, the aura of mystery remained. To this day, belladonna and her sisters carry the whisper of cauldrons and chants, moonlight and secrecy. A universal archetype, it is striking to notice how every culture, in every era, seems to hold stories of dangerous plants. Whether in Europe, Asia, Africa, or the Americas, there is always a flower, a root, or a berry that glows with allure, yet hides a deadly truth. Belladonna belongs to this wider family of myth. She is not alone, but one face in a universal archetype, the Badenader, deadly beauty of nature. For some, she symbolizes temptation. For others, forbidden wisdom. And for many, she embodies the eternal truth that all beauty carries risk. A gentle reminder, as you breathe softly now, listening to these stories, you may notice how the mind drifts, how tales of plants and legends weave into dreams. That is the gift of folklore. It reminds us not just of danger but of imagination. The plants of the midnight garden are not merely poisons. They are teachers, mirrors of the human soul. Belladonna, among her sisters, asks us to see with clarity, to recognize allure, to respect danger, and to honor the thin veil between beauty and death. A broader mirror of beauty. The story of belladonna is not just about one plant or one time. It is about humanity's enduring willingness to suffer for beauty, to risk health for the promise of allure. To see it clearly, we must wander beyond Victorian parlors and step into other worlds, other ages, where women and men alike found their own dangerous, enchanting rituals. So let us drift softly, as though carried on a night breeze, across continents and centuries. Our lantern is lit, our steps quiet. Each culture we pass through will offer a glimpse, a reflection of belladonna's ghost wearing a new mask, whispering in a different tongue. Japan, the porcelain ideal. We arrive first in old Japan. Imagine a tea house, soft paper screens glowing, with lantern light. A woman kneels gracefully, her movements delicate as water rippling. Her face is a canvas of porcelain white. For centuries, Japanese ideals of beauty exalted pale skin, a symbol of refinement and nobility. Women painted their faces with oshiroi, a white powder often made with lead. It smoothed imperfections, created a flawless surface, and gave the illusion of moonlight upon the skin. But the powder was toxic. Over time, it damaged skin, corroded health, and yet it persisted. Why? Because pale beauty was not mere vanity. It was a marker of social standing, a declaration of belonging to a world above labor, above the sun's touch. The porcelain face was as haunting as belladonna's ghostly gaze. One widened the eyes with poison, the other whitened the skin with lead. Both revealed the same truth, the desire to transform, to embody an ideal no matter the cost. India. The dark charm of Kajal now, let the lantern guide us westward into the warm air of India. Here, beauty was expressed through contrast, through the deepening of the eyes. For thousands of years, women, men, and children alike lined their eyelids with kajal, a dark cosmetic made from soot, oils, and herbs. At times it was protective, believed to ward off the evil eye. At other times, it was purely aesthetic, sharpening the gaze, making eyes gleam like polished obsidian. But the history of kajal also carries shadows. In some eras, lead compounds were mixed into the cosmetic, enhancing its depth but poisoning the wearer slowly. Mothers traced it on their babies' eyes, not knowing that the substance might harm the very children they sought to protect. And so we see again a paradox: beauty, protection, and health entangled with danger. The dark eyes of India mirror the dilated eyes of Victorian women, both born of cultural longing, both tinged with risk. The Middle East, coal and sacred darkness. From India, we drift softly into desert winds toward the Middle East. Here, for millennia, people have adorned their eyes with kohl. It is perhaps one of the oldest cosmetics in the world, used in ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, Arabia. Cleopatra herself was said to line her eyes with kohl, her gaze sharp, captivating, unforgettable. Beyond beauty, kohl was practical. It shielded eyes from the glare of the sun and the irritation of dust. But its power was also spiritual, believed to protect from envy, from misfortune, from unseen forces. Yet, like kajal, some kohl recipes contained lead. The shimmer of danger lay hidden within the ritual of adornment. When we imagine Cleopatra's dark-lined eyes, when we see Bedouin women today still tracing their lashes with kohl, we glimpse the same archetype, the dangerous, sacred beauty of the eyes. It is belladonna's story again, but told under desert stars instead of gaslit Victorian lamps. Europe. Before belladonna, lead, mercury, and pale ghosts. Before the Victorians turned to belladonna, Europe had long embraced its own toxic trends. In Elizabethan England, women sought the mask of youth, a flawless white complexion painted with Venetian ceruse, a mixture of white lead and vinegar. It shimmered in candlelight, smooth and pale, but beneath its skin cracked, aged, and poisoned. In the 18th century, rouge was added, bright circles of red upon the cheeks, often laced with mercury. The combination created an otherworldly face, doll-like, ghostly, and yet fatally fragile. These women, powdered and painted, were already living ghosts before belladonna ever touched their eyes. The Victorians only carried the tradition, further, choosing to make the eyes themselves into haunting beacons. China, the bound feet of beauty. Let us step further east again, into Imperial China, where the pursuit of beauty was not only chemical, but physical. For centuries, girls' feet were bound tightly from childhood, reshaped into the small, curved form known as lotus feet. The practice was painful, often crippling, but it was considered the height of beauty and desirability. To walk was to limp, to suffer, but also to embody elegance in the eyes of society. Though it differs from belladonna's ghostly gaze, the logic was the same. Sacrifice the body for an aesthetic ideal, accept suffering as the price of allure. Africa, scarification, and symbols of beauty in Africa. Traditions of beauty sometimes took the form of scarification, deliberate, intricate markings cut into the skin, leaving raised patterns that told stories of lineage, strength, and allure. To outsiders, it may seem painful or dangerous. But within its cultural context, it was a celebration of identity, resilience, and belonging. While not poisonous in the same way as belladonna, it speaks to the same theme. The body transformed through endurance, marked forever by beauties, and the universality of risk in beauty. When we step back and see these rituals side by side, a pattern emerges. Japan sought ghostly pallor with lead powder. India deepened eyes with kajal, sometimes tainted with lead. The Middle East traced kohl, both protective and perilous. Europe painted with ceruse and mercury, ghost-making long before belladonna. China reshaped feet, weaving pain into elegance. Africa carved beauty into the skin through scarification. Every culture had its belladonna, its moment where allure and risk intertwined. The plant itself was European, but the archetype it represented is universal. A global ghost. So, dear listener, imagine now that same midnight garden where we met hemlock, mandrake, and datura. But this time the garden expands. In one corner, a Japanese mirror glimmers, reflecting a porcelain face. In another, the desert wind carries the scent of coal. A Chinese slipper, impossibly small, rests beneath a tree. And across the garden, faint patterns of scarification gleam in the moonlight. The ghost of belladonna is not alone here. She is joined by sisters from every continent, every age, all whispering the same truth. Beauty and danger are bound, like vines twisting around the same trellis. Drifting into reflection, as you breathe softly, let these images drift around you, like smoke. The rituals may seem distant, foreign, or strange, but they are part of a shared human longing. A longing to be seen, admired, remembered. A longing so powerful that it draws us to powders, paints, poisons, and pains. In this gentle reflection, we see ourselves mirrored in history, not as judges of folly, but as fellow dreamers, equally bound to the hope of transformation. The strange Victorian drug that turned women into ghosts was only one chapter in a much larger story. The story of beauty itself, shimmering with allure, edged with shadow, and always alive in the human heart. The ghost in the mind breathes softly now, dear listener. We have walked through gardens of poison, through palaces of powder and paint, across cultures and centuries. But our journey tonight does not stop with history alone. For the ghost of belladonna is more than a plant, more than a fad. It is also a symbol, a metaphor. When Victorians widened their eyes into ghostly orbs, they were not only reshaping their appearance, they were reflecting a deeper longing, to be seen, to transcend the ordinary, to inhabit a beauty that seemed almost supernatural. And so, the living ghost became a mirror of the human psyche. Freud and the uncanny Sigmund Freud, the great pioneer of psychoanalysis, wrote of the uncanny, that strange sensation when something is both familiar and alien at the same time. The ghostly face is uncanny. It is recognizably human yet altered in unsettling ways. Eyes too wide, pupils too dark, skin too pale. It is beauty that has crossed into the realm of the eerie. Freud saw the uncanny as a return of the repressed, the surfacing of hidden fears or desires. Perhaps then the Victorian fascination with belladonna was not just fashion, but the unconscious brought into sight. The ghostly woman, admired at the ball, was also feared. She embodied both allure and death, attraction and repulsion. Belladonna became not just a drug but a stage for the uncanny to perform. Jung and the shadow Carl Jung, Freud's student and rival, spoke of the shadow, the hidden aspects of ourselves that we deny or repress. He believed that to grow we must face this shadow, integrate it and accept its truths. The ghostly face of belladonna, then, may be seen as a shadow image of beauty. It is beauty made extreme, unnatural, revealing the dangers that polite society wished to hide. The Victorians were obsessed with appearances, with morality, with purity. Yet beneath it all there was fear, of death, of illness, of decay. The living ghost was both fantasy and warning. She was the shadow of society's own vanity, parading in plain sight. Gothic literature, the haunting face, to understand the ghostly. Beauty of belladonna. We must step into the pages of Gothic literature so beloved in the very era that adored the plant. Think of Bram Stoker's Dracula. The vampire's gaze is hypnotic, irresistible, yet deadly. It mirrors the belladonna gaze, eyes that draw you in, but at a price, or Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. The creature, though monstrous, is described at times with unsettling beauty. His face stitched together evokes the uncanny, familiar yet distorted. The Victorians read these stories by candlelight, then painted their faces and widened their eyes with poison. It was as if they wanted to step into the Gothic novel, to embody the haunted characters they feared and admired. The ghost as desire. Why ghosts, dear listener? Why do we keep returning to them again and again in story and ritual? Perhaps because the ghost embodies desire unfulfilled. It lingers, unable to rest, haunting the living with its unresolved yearning. And beauty, too, is a kind of ghost. Always, fleeting, never permanent, always slipping through our fingers no matter how tightly we grasp. The Victorian woman who turned herself into a living ghost was not only embodying allure, she was embodying impermanence. Her beauty shimmered for a night, a season, a year, before poison, illness, or age reclaimed it. She was haunting herself, even as she dazzled others. Modern poetry and the ghostly image writers after the Victorians continued to use the ghostly face as symbol. In modernist poetry, the pale woman often appears as a figure of melancholy, beauty that cannot last. Consider T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, where women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. Their presence is spectral, drifting, half real. It is not belladonna specifically, but the same haunting image. Beauty is something seen from a distance, never touched, always ghost-like. Later poets, too, return to the pale face, the wide eyes, the fragile form. It is an archetype that will not fade. The ghost in psychology. Today, in our own time, psychologists speak less of ghosts and more of archetypes, symbols, and collective memory. Yet the ghost remains a powerful metaphor. We speak of being haunted by memories, by regrets, by lost loves. We describe trauma as something that lingers, returns, replays itself. These are the modern ghosts, not of houses, but of the mind. The Victorian woman who drank belladonna to widen her eyes was, in a sense, externalizing this haunting. She made herself a living symbol of longing, of impermanence, of mortality. The ghostly gaze in film and art. When cinema was born, the ghostly gaze carried easily onto the screen. Silent films, with their exaggerated makeup and pale lighting, often gave actors the same spectral look as belladonna eyes. Later, horror films borrowed the archetype. Think of the wide, dark eyes of Nosferatu, the ghostly pallor of Gothic heroines, the shimmering beauty of characters who seem both alive and not. Even today, in fashion and art photography, models are sometimes styled to look ethereal, pale, so ghost-like. It is an echo of belladonna, a fascination with beauty that unsettles as much as it enchants. Living ghosts within us. We breathe here together, softly, in the stillness. We may recognize that the ghost is not only out there, in history or literature. It is also within us. Each of us carries memories, dreams, desires that linger like phantoms. Each of us knows the ache of impermanence, the fleeting shimmer of beauty, the wish to hold on just a little longer. The Victorian woman who widened her eyes with belladonna was not so different from us. She longed to be radiant, unforgettable, desired. She longed, perhaps, to rise above the ordinary and step into legend, and though her methods were perilous, her longing was deeply human. drifting into rest, so, dear listener, let the ghostly images soften now. Pale faces fade into mist. Eyes close gently, no longer widened by poison but resting in calm. The ghost becomes a companion, not a terror, a reminder that beauty is fleeting, but memory endures. The strange Victorian drug that turned women into living ghosts was more than a fad. It was a reflection of our timeless dance with desire, danger, and the dream of becoming something more than mortal. And as you drift now, let yourself feel light, calm, and safe. The ghosts are not here to harm you. They are simply stories softly told, guiding you deeper into rest. A new dawn of knowledge. Breathe in softly, dear listener, and picture the first light of dawn breaking over Victorian rooftops. The gas lamps dim, the fog begins to lift, and a new century whispers on the horizon. It is not only the city that awakens, it is human knowledge itself. For centuries, beauty rituals had danced in the shadows of mystery, guided by superstition, folklore, and risky experimentation. But as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, science began to pull back the veil. Chemistry, medicine, and technology stepped forward, exposing the dangers of ghost-making drugs and powders. The age of belladonna, arsenic, and lead was ending. A new era of safer beauty was beginning. Chemistry unveils its secrets. The Victorian fascination with ghostly beauty coincided with a blossoming of chemistry as a science. In laboratories lit by oil lamps, chemists identified poisons, mapped their effects, and devised safer alternatives. Belladonna's deadly alkaloids, atropine, scopolamine, hyoscyamine, were isolated and studied. Doctors recognized their uses in medicine, to dilate pupils for surgery, to treat certain heart conditions, to relax muscles. But they also understood the risks. No longer could belladonna masquerade as an innocent beauty aid. Similarly, the powders that had once been brushed onto pale faces, laden with lead carbonate, were condemned as toxic. Physicians published warnings of lead palsy and arsenical cachexia, conditions caused by repeated exposure. The very products once praised for elegance were now revealed as silent killers. Public health and awareness. As the 19th century progressed, public health campaigns slowly took shape. Medical journals and women's magazines began to print articles, warning of poisonous cosmetics. Doctors urged women to avoid venefic beauty aids, as they were called, venefic meaning rooted in venom. The message was clear. What glitters on the skin may fester in the blood. What widens the eye may narrow the heart's chances. Gradually, awareness spread. The ghostly face was no longer a mark of fashion, but of danger. The rise of safer cosmetics. With warnings came opportunity. Entrepreneurs and inventors began to create new cosmetics free of deadly ingredients. By the late Victorian era, cold cream had become popular, a soothing blend of oils and waxes that cleansed and softened skin without poison. Perfumed soaps, mass-produced in factories, replaced homemade concoctions of uncertain safety. Powders were reformulated with rice starch, zinc oxide, or talc instead of lead. Lipsticks and rouges, once frowned upon, began to be made with carmine and vegetable dyes. Beauty did not vanish with belladonna. It simply found safer vessels. The influence of medicine doctors, too, played a role in reshaping beauty. As the field of ophthalmology developed, pupil dilation was recognized as useful for eye examinations, but only under careful medical supervision. Atropine, derived from belladonna, was standardized into controlled doses, no longer left to the whims of fashion. Thus the ghostly gaze found a new place, not in the ballroom but in the clinic. The drug that once endangered lives was tamed, refined, and harnessed for healing. This marked a turning point. The same knowledge that once tempted society into danger was now guiding it toward safety. Shifts in culture and fashion science was not the only force pulling society away from ghostly ideals. Culture itself was changing. The late 19th century saw the rise of the aesthetic movement, which celebrated natural beauty and artistic expression. Rather than pale, deathly faces, the new ideal was freshness, simplicity, and health. Women were encouraged to embrace a more natural look. Rosy cheeks from outdoor walks, brightness from fresh air, vitality from exercise. The pale, ghostly visage was slowly replaced by the image of a glowing, healthy woman. By the early 20th century, beauty manuals urged readers to cultivate health as the truest cosmetic. The living ghost was fading, and in her place appeared the living, breathing woman. Industrialization and accessibility. Another shift came from industrialization. With new factories and mass production, cosmetics became more accessible, standardized, and regulated. No longer did women have to rely on dangerous homemade recipes or untested powders sold in small apothecaries. Large companies, eager to build trust, marketed their products as safe, pure, and modern. Advertisements promised, scientifically, tested creams and harmless powders. Though not all were truly risk-free, the overall trend moved steadily away from belladonna and arsenic. The modern beauty industry was being born, out of the ashes of the ghostly past. The decline of the living ghost as the new century dawned. The image of the ghostly woman faded into memory. The wide, dark pupils that once dazzled were now viewed with suspicion. The pale, powdery skin that once shimmered under candlelight looked out of place under electric bulbs. By the 1920s, a revolution in beauty was underway. Hollywood films projected stars with bold lips, defined eyes, and glowing skin. The living ghost had no place on the silver screen. Instead, vibrancy became the new ideal. Belladonna was left behind, a relic of a darker time. The lessons of history. And yet, dear listener, we must remember, though science and culture moved forward, the story of belladonna remains a lesson. It teaches us that beauty and danger often walk together. That society, in its longing for allure, sometimes embraces shadows it does not understand. And that knowledge, slowly, carefully, can lift the veil, replacing poison with safety, obsession with wisdom. The ghostly women of the Victorian age may have vanished, but their story continues to whisper. A reminder, soft yet firm, that every pursuit of beauty carries questions. What price are we willing to pay? What shadows are we willing to wear? A pause for rest. As you breathe now, let the ghostly images dissolve. The powders, the potions, the glimmering eyes, they drift away like mist in the morning sun. What remains is clarity, light, safety. The Victorians sought beauty through danger, but we can find peace in simplicity. The strange drug that once turned women into ghosts is now only a story, softly told. And in this telling, we are reminded of how far we have come. Rest here in this gentle awareness. Let the knowledge soothe you. That progress, though slow, always moves forward, guiding us toward safer shores. Shadows that linger, close your eyes, dear listener, and imagine a mist drifting across time. The 19th century has faded, yet the shapes of its obsessions still glow faintly, like embers that refuse to die. Though belladonna is no longer dropped, into eyes at dressing tables its influence lingers in subtler forms. For beauty is not only about powders and creams, it is about symbols, about the way culture envisions allure. And the ghostly aesthetic of Victorian women has never truly left us. It has simply transformed, adapted, finding new stages upon which to haunt. The Gothic revival in fashion, one place where the ghostly aesthetic resurfaces, is in fashion itself. Across the decades, designers have returned to pale skin, dark eyes, and spectral silhouettes. Think of the Gothic subculture, which arose in the late 20th century. Its adherents wear flowing black clothes, pale foundation, and dramatic eye makeup. The look is haunting yet beautiful, echoing the Victorian fascination with ghost-like allure. Runway shows, too, have embraced the aesthetic. Designers such as Alexander McQueen crafted collections that celebrated pale models in eerie gowns, their faces ethereal, their bodies like phantoms drifting across the stage. It was not belladonna, but artistry, yet the echoes of the living ghost could be felt. Film and the ghostly gaze cinema, too, has kept the ghost alive. In horror and fantasy films, the pale woman with wide eyes appears again and again, from the haunting brides of Dracula to modern films like The Others and Crimson Peak. The ghostly aesthetic is used to stir both fascination and fear. Even in mainstream culture, pale complexions and darkened eyes sometimes return as fashionable trends. Consider the 1990s era of heroin chic models. Faces drawn, skin pale, eyes shadowed. Though controversial, it was another iteration of the ghostly allure. The camera, much like the candlelight of the Victorian ballroom, loves the face that looks both fragile and otherworldly. Literature and the pale heroine writers, too, continue to resurrect the ghostly beauty. From Gothic romance novels to modern young adult fiction, the pale, mysterious heroine remains a staple. She is often described with luminous skin, dark eyes, and an air of fragility. She is alluring precisely because she seems untouchable, half-real, drifting at the edges of the ordinary world. In this way, the literary ghost is not so different from her Victorian ancestor. She is still a symbol of longing, of impermanence, of desire that cannot be grasped. Cosmetics. Echoes of the past. Even in the world of modern cosmetics, ghostly echoes remain. Though no one uses belladonna to dilate pupils anymore, wide eyes are still prized. Instead of poison, we now use eyeliner, mascara, and contact lenses to create the effect of larger, darker eyes. Skin lightening products, though controversial, continue to be marketed in parts of the world. They echo the Victorian pursuit of pale skin, though packaged in modern formulas, and in certain fashion cycles, pale foundation or dramatic contouring returns, giving models the ethereal look once achieved through dangerous powders. The methods have changed, but the desire to appear ghost-like, untouchable, mysterious has not fully disappeared. The ghost in subcultures thrive on what mainstream society has abandoned, and many have embraced the ghostly aesthetic as their own. The goth scene treasures pale faces framed by dark hair, dramatic clothing, and haunting makeup. The Lolita fashion of Japan sometimes incorporates ghostly Victorian looks, with lace, parasols, and porcelain complexions. Even the K-pop and J-pop industries at times celebrate idols with strikingly pale skin, drawing from both Western and Eastern beauty ideals. The living ghost has simply traveled across cultures, wearing new garments, singing new songs. The ghost, in photography and art, visual artists, too, draw upon the aesthetic of belladonna. Photographers stage portraits with pale models in shadowed rooms, lit by candles or moonlight. Painters create works in which faces glow faintly against dark backgrounds, recalling the chiaroscuro of the Victorian parlor. In these works, the ghostly woman is not a warning of poison, but a muse. She becomes a timeless symbol of fragility and mystery. Modern psychology. Why we still long for the ghost. Why, dear listener, do we still find the ghostly beautiful? Why does the pale face, the wide eye, the ethereal silhouette continue to enchant? Perhaps it is because ghostliness represents the boundary between worlds. It suggests both presence and absence, beauty and decay, allure and danger. It touches the deepest human fascinations, with mortality, with mystery, with the unknown. In a way, the ghostly woman embodies contradiction itself. She is fragile but powerful, desired but feared, human yet otherworldly. She is the ultimate metaphor for the fleeting nature of life, a symbol that will not die. The Victorians may have abandoned belladonna, but they left behind something more enduring, an archetype. The pale, ghostly beauty now belongs to culture itself. It rises and falls with fashion, with art, with literature, but it never disappears completely. Each generation finds a new way to paint her face, to dress her form, to cast her in stories and images. She is eternal because she is more than a fad. She is a mirror of our longing for beauty that escapes time, beauty that feels supernatural, beauty that is always on the edge of vanishing. Resting with the ghosts. And now, as we breathe together in stillness, we may allow the ghosts to rest beside us, not as terrors but as companions. The strange Victorian drug that turned women into living ghosts may be gone, but the ghostly image remains, soft, and haunting. Echoing through fashion, film, and art, it is not poison anymore. It is memory, symbol, metaphor. And in that transformation, the danger is soothed, the obsession softened, the story turned into a gentle lullaby. So let yourself rest now, dear listener. Pale faces drift into the mist, wide eyes close, safe and calm. The living ghost lingers only in imagination, guiding us toward dreams.